In the summer of 1941, the lands between the Baltic and the Black Sea entered a new phase of imperial governance shaped by two consecutive occupations. The first had begun after the German-Soviet Pact of 23 August 1939, and its secret protocols partitioned spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Between September 1939 and June 1940, the USSR annexed eastern Poland, then incorporated Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and on 28 June 1940 took Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania. Soviet administrative integration brought nationalization, security policing, and conscription. In the Baltic republics alone, security services arrested or deported tens of thousands. During the mass action of June 14th to 15th, 1941, approximately 17,500 people in Lithuania, 15,400 in Latvia, and 10,000 in Estonia were deported to the interior. In annexed eastern Poland, new borders and collectivization altered property and political life. These measures shaped local perceptions when German forces crossed the border 9 days later. Operation Barbarossa opened on 22nd June 1941 with about 3.3 million Axis personnel in Army Groups North, Center, and South, facing roughly 2.9 million Red Army soldiers in the western military districts. Army Group North advanced toward the Baltic ports and Leningrad. Army Group Center drove through Belarus toward Smolensk and Moscow. Army Group South moved across western Ukraine toward Kiev and the Dnipro line. Within the first 8 weeks, Wehrmacht mobile formations captured or encircled large Soviet forces at Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk in the center, and at Uman and Kiev in the south, producing prisoner counts in the hundreds of thousands at each encirclement. Front lines moved rapidly, displacing existing Soviet governance and creating a vacuum that military administration filled temporarily through area commands, while Berlin debated long-term political arrangements. German planning for civil rule had formed before the invasion. On July 17, 1941, Adolf Hitler created the Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories and appointed Alfred Rosenberg as minister. The same decree envisaged two major civil administrations: Reichskommissariat Ostland, covering Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Belarus, and Reichskommissariat Ukraine, covering central and western Ukrainian territories with a headquarters planned at Rivne. Hinrich Lohse, previously Oberpresident of Schleswig-Holstein, became Reichskommissar for Ostland with Riga as his seat. Erich Koch, Gauleiter of East Prussia, became Reichskommissar for Ukraine and established his staff in Rivne in September. Below them, Generalkommissare and Gebietskommissare would administer districts and counties, while economic officials, police, and the security services operated in parallel chains of command. In practice, responsibility intersected and competed with the Wehrmacht, the SS, and agencies tied to the four-year plan. Multiple groups entered this new administrative space with divergent expectations. German civilian planners and economic officials sought agricultural surpluses, timber, flax, and access to Black Sea and Baltic ports, calculating harvests and rail capacities to supply the Reich and its armed forces. Security authorities and SS leadership prioritized political control and the destruction of perceived enemies. Wehrmacht commanders demanded stable rear areas, labor, and repair capability for supply lines extending 600 to 1,000 kilometers from the German frontier. Each institution defined order differently, and the lines between military necessity, ideological policy, and resource extraction were not clearly drawn. Local political actors attempted to shape outcomes. In Lithuania, the Lithuanian Activist Front proclaimed a provisional government in Kaunas on the 23rd of June, 1941, during the anti-Soviet uprising. It sought recognition and control over administration, police, and the economy. Similar efforts appeared in Latvia and Estonia, where returning politicians and underground groups attempted to restore pre-1940 institutions or adapt them to the new occupiers. In western Ukraine, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists split between the factions of Stepan Bandera and Andriy Melnik. On the 30th of June 1941, Leaders aligned with Bandera announced in Lviv an act of restoration of statehood and proposed a provisional cabinet under Yaroslav Stetsko. German authorities refused to recognize these declarations. Arrests followed in July and September, removing key figures from the scene. In the Baltics, German civil administration retained some local personnel in lower offices and police, but dissolved national cabinets by August 1941. Soviet institutions did not simply vanish. Retreating Red Army units destroyed depots and bridges along principal rail corridors, while People's Commissariats evacuated industrial assets east. By late July 1941, over 1,000 industrial enterprises across Ukraine and Belarus had either been dismantled or were in transit. Rolling stock and tractors were removed or sabotaged. Party and security networks left behind clandestine cells with instructions to gather intelligence and assist future operations. These measures complicated German calculations about immediate resource availability and contributed to the difference between economic projections on paper and deliveries from the first harvest season. Demography and space structured the task facing the new administrations. Ostland encompassed roughly 8 to 9 million inhabitants in 1941, depending on the boundary drawn with Army Group Center's military zone in Belarus. The territory included ice-free ports like Liepaja and Tallinn, forests exploited for timber, and agricultural districts producing rye and flax. The Reichskommissariat, Ukraine, included, at its maximal extent under civil rule, approximately 16 to 17 million people across Volhynia, Podylia, Kyiv region, and the steppe to the Dnipro bend. The Donbass and the Crimea remained under military rule for much of 1941 to 1942. Rail lines ran predominantly on the Soviet 1,520 mm gauge, requiring conversion to the European 1,435 mm gauge. By autumn 1941, German railway troops had converted thousands of kilometers, but capacity still lagged behind operational demand. The administrative map thus overlaid a logistical map dominated by junctions at Minsk, Vilnius, Riga, Kyiv, and Kharkiv, with coastal outlets at Riga, Tallinn, and Mykolaiv. Public sentiment varied by region and social group. Some communities that had experienced arrests and property seizures in 1940 to 1941 anticipated restoration of pre-annexation arrangements or national autonomy. Others feared renewed requisitions, forced labor, or reprisals. Jewish communities faced immediate threat from the first weeks of the invasion. The combination of security directives, local violence, and the arrival of specialist units produced outcomes that would define occupation policy in ways not foreseen by all German civil administrators in July. Peasant households measured new authorities by tax rates and grain deliveries. Urban workers and clerks assessed employment, wages, and ration scales in cities where Soviet evacuations had disrupted supply. By September 1941, the formal transition from military to civil administration had begun in large zones behind the front, but jurisdictional boundaries remained fluid. As Army Group South pushed beyond the Dnipro and Army Group North closed the ring around Leningrad, rear areas stretched and required garrisons to secure railways and depots. Feldkommandanturen still issued orders where civil offices were not staffed. Security police operated on their own instructions. Economic commands set procurement targets that had to pass through the same railheads needed by the army. The administrative experiment thus started amid moving front lines, competing bureaucracies, and populations with recent memories of one departing regime and uncertain expectations of the next. The transfer from military to civil authority began unevenly in July to October 1941 as front lines stabilized behind army groups north and south. In Berlin, the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories issued organizational charts that divided responsibility between two new civil jurisdictions, Ostland and Ukraine. In Ostland, the seat in Riga coordinated 4 general commissariate, created for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus. In Ukraine, the seat in Rivne coordinated districts planned for Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and a southern coastal zone linked to Crimea. Staffing advanced in stages. German officials arrived first in major towns, while county offices, Gebiete, opened only where garrisons already controlled rail junctions and depots. The Wehrmacht retained executive powers and broad security belts along the main supply lines. Civil functionaries could issue ordinances only if military commanders did not object. This arrangement shaped the first months of rule more than any decree in Berlin. Security command lines were established in parallel. Police and SS leaders organized regional headquarters to coordinate order police battalions and security police detachments. In the Baltic zone, higher SS leadership concentrated staff in Riga and Kaunas and deployed police regiments to secure rail corridors, Riga, Daugavpils, and Kaunas-Vilnius. In Ukraine, security staff moved into Rivne, Kiev, and Zhytomyr by September, assigning mobile units to Dnipro crossings at Kremenchuk and Dnipropetrovsk, and to the Odessa-Mykolaiv road net. These forces guarded bridges, warehouses, and grain receiving stations, conducted identity checks, and registered local police formations, recruited from pre-war constabulary personnel and new auxiliaries. The Wehrmacht's rear area commands retained authority over rail traffic and fuel allotments, and maintained field courts. Friction developed early, when civil administrations demanded office space and communications lines already assigned to army supply commands. Initial ordinances addressed currency, food, and property. Soviet rubles remained legal tender in both Ostland and Ukraine during the transition, but civil commissioners introduced fixed exchange rates for Reichsmarks and occupation coupons to stabilize markets near garrisons and ports. Grain delivery schedules were set for the 1941 harvest, using district quotas derived from pre-war statistics. In Baltic districts, rye and barley quotas were targeted to feed garrisons and supply shipments to East Prussia by sea from Liepaja and Ventspils. In Ukraine, wheat and sunflower deliveries were directed to river ports on the Dnipro and railheads at Shepetivka, Korostin, and Fastiv for onward transport to the general government and the Reich. Compensation for requisition goods varied by locality and often depended on military finance officers rather than civil treasuries, creating unequal price regimes between adjacent counties. Municipal administrations restarted with mixed personnel. Town halls reopened under German mayors or commissioners, but clerical staffs included former municipal employees who had worked under pre-1940 regimes and under the Soviet systems of 1940 to 1941. Registry offices began to record births, deaths, and changes of domicile. Ration lists were compiled by household. Police stations enrolled night watches to secure markets and bakeries. In Riga, Tallinn, and Kaunas, tram services resumed on limited schedules once power plants repaired damaged boilers and found coal stocks. In Kiev, where fighting and demolitions had destroyed bridges in central districts, trams did not operate in the early weeks. Handcarts and horse wagons dominated distribution, and municipal offices prioritized water supply and the removal of debris from government quarters around Kreshchatyk after explosions in late September. Rail and road control dominated the opening phase. Railway troops converted gauge on primary lines to the European 1,435 mm standard to bring locomotives and wagons from East Prussia and the general government onto the captured network. By October 1941, through traffic reached major depots in Minsk, Riga, and Vilnius in the north, and to Shepetivka and Kiev in the south. Freight priorities were set daily: fuel, ammunition, rations for front units, and then civil administration cargo such as flour, salt, and medical supplies. Where bridges remained down or approaches were mined, local administrations relied on rivercraft and improvised ferries. Motor transport shortages required pooling trucks among civil, military, and police users. Many districts recorded daily availability below planned figures, with repair backlogs caused by the lack of spare parts for seized Soviet types. Public communication framed expectations. German-language newspapers issued occupation bulletins explaining new ordinances. In the Baltics, some papers carried sections in local languages that reported on municipal services, reopening of schools, and agricultural instructions. In Ukrainian cities, notices announced the reorganization of markets, recruitment for municipal labor brigades, and the reopening of churches closed in 1940 to 1941. Radio transmitters broadcast short news segments relayed from Berlin and Königsberg. In rural zones, receivers were rare, and information spread through village elders, priests, and gendarmerie patrols. Civil offices promised legal security for property, the right to worship, and the restoration of cultural associations within limits set by the occupiers. At the same time, curfews, identity card regimes, and reporting obligations for travel were introduced, and police authorities defined categories of persons subject to registration, labor assignment, or detention. Local political groups tested the boundaries of these arrangements. In Lithuania, municipal committees proposed transitional charters that referenced the interwar constitution and asked to manage schools, courts, and police subject to oversight. In Latvia and Estonia, former officials attempted to standardize municipal law across towns to avoid case-by-case rulings by German district offices. In Western Ukraine, civic groups and church hierarchies sought permission to reopen seminaries and publish bulletins. German civil administrations accepted parts of these programs that simplified daily governance but retained vetoes over appointments to schools, courts, and police. Higher police leaders issued instructions that political parties and paramilitary organizations would not be recognized, and security police conducted arrests of activists whose platforms implied sovereign statehood. Economic offices began inventories of agricultural, industrial, and port assets. In the Baltics, flax and timber inventories were prioritized alongside shipyard capacity in Tallinn and Riga for repair of coastal craft. In Ukraine, grain, livestock, and oilseed stocks were recorded by rural procurement boards, while urban teams counted machine tools left in factories where Soviet dismantling had been incomplete. Coal shipments from Donbass did not reach civil zones in significant quantities during the opening phase. City fuel plants relied on wood and limited peat. Comparative figures from the first 2 months showed that deliveries along the Riga-Daugavpils line approached pre-war monthly averages for timber by late autumn, while grain shipments from central Ukraine remained below projected tonnage because of damaged bridges on the Dnipro and competing military demand. Population movements complicated administration. Evacuation had removed a share of skilled workers from cities such as Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa. In the Baltics, deportations earlier in 1941 and mobilization had reduced available male labor for municipal services. Civil authorities instituted labor registration between ages defined in each district, often 16 to 60 for men and 18 to 45 for women, with exemptions for essential occupations. The Wehrmacht requisitioned labor for road repair crews on supply routes supporting army groups north and south. Civil administrations negotiated quotas to keep sanitation, bakeries, and power plants operating. These measures differed by locality and produced contrasting outcomes. Some towns restored basic services within weeks, while others faced recurrent interruptions in water and food distribution when labor detachments were reassigned. The first phase ended without a uniform template. In Ostland, county offices functioned where ports and railheads provided steady supply. Coastal districts reported more consistent bread rations than inland counties depended on road convoys. In Ukraine, administrative reach thinned with distance from the main rail trunk lines. Towns close to junctions re-established markets and limited municipal services, while districts beyond river crossings remained under mixed military-police control. Across both jurisdictions, the initial months set two patterns that would persist: overlapping chains of command in which civil, military, and police offices issued concurrent directives, and a budget of transport and labor that forced daily trade-offs between frontline logistics and civilian supply. These structural conditions framed all subsequent decisions about autonomy, requisition, and order in the occupied territories. Strategic planning for civil rule in the East proceeded along three overlapping lines: political control, economic extraction, and security of communications. Politically, the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories designed a layered hierarchy to translate central directives into county ordinances, while excluding any institutions that implied sovereignty. Draft statutes for Ostland and Ukraine defined Reichskommissariat as holders of full executive authority. Beneath them, Generalkommissare and Gebietskommissare issued regulations on courts, police, schooling, and property registration. Advisory councils of local notables were discussed in memoranda, but limited to consultative roles without legislative power. Parallel to this, the SS and police established higher SS and police leaders responsible for security and population policy, with authority to direct order police regiments and security police field offices. The Wehrmacht retained military jurisdiction over rail corridors, depots, and bridgeheads, administered by rear area commands that could overrule civilian requests when they conflicted with supply to the front. Economic planning centered on harvest flows, raw materials, and transport capacity. Agricultural staffs compiled district-level sowing and yield tables derived from pre-war statistics and early field surveys in July-August 1941. Procurement boards set delivery quotas for rye, wheat, barley, oats, potatoes, and oil seeds. Livestock tallies tracked cattle, pigs, and sheep by county. Industrial sections inventoried flax, timber, peat, and machine tools left in factories not dismantled before the Soviet evacuation. Ports at Riga, Ventspils, and Tallinn were assigned timber and flax exports. Inland elevators in Ukraine were tasked with grain assemblies for movement to Dnipro river ports and rail junctions at Shepetivka, Fastiv, and Korostan. Daily freight graphs prepared by railway staffs listed priority classes in sequence: ammunition, fuel, rations for front units, then civil cargo. Road services drew up haulage rosters that pooled German and locally requisitioned trucks, with repair schedules managed by army workshops and municipal garages. The planning assumption in both Ostland and Ukraine was that rail would carry the bulk of freight once primary lines were converted to the European gauge and once bridges received temporary truss spans. Security planning joined static garrisons with mobile patrols. Rear area commands calculated garrison strengths for stations, bridges, and warehouses based on a rule of companies per kilometer, a vulnerable line, adjusted for terrain and river crossings. Police regiments were assigned to sectors that matched rail districts, allowing company-sized detachments to move by train to reported incidents. Local auxiliary police were recruited to guard markets, municipal offices, and rural roadblocks. Their numbers were scaled to population density and distances between villages. Curfew hours, identity card formats, travel permits, and reporting requirements for guests and lodgers were standardized to reduce confusion among district staffs. Field courts and summary jurisdiction were laid out in circulars to define which offenses remained under military law and which fell to civil courts once these reopened. Propaganda and public information were integrated into administrative plans. Occupation bulletins in Riga and Kaunas announced ordinances in German and local languages. In Ukraine, notices appeared in Kiev, Rivne, and Zhytomyr, with instructions on ration coupons, market days, and labor registration. Radio transmitters in Riga and Tallinn broadcast schedules that mixed municipal service updates with reprints of central news. Cultural and religious policy emphasized reopening churches and associations that did not claim political authority. School plans proposed phased reintroduction of primary education, using pre-1940 textbooks where available, with language instruction aligned to local usage. All political subjects were removed. The intent was to present the administration as predictable in everyday matters while keeping political decision-making centralized. Miscalculations emerged at the planning stage. Yield projections used pre-war averages that did not account for disrupted sowing in spring 1941, the loss of draft animals during the retreat, or fuel shortages for threshing and transport. Railway timetables assumed through traffic speeds that were not attainable on track, damaged by demolition, or on lines newly converted and still lacking ballast and signaling. Port repair schedules underestimated the time to replace cranes and boiler parts. Labor plans that relied on voluntary recruitment from municipal services proved insufficient in cities that had lost skilled workers to evacuation or mobilization. Authorities responded by extending labor registration to wider age bands and by introducing work obligations tied to ration eligibility. Soviet planning adjusted to the occupation along two axes: denial of resources to the occupier and preparation for future counteroffensives. Economic commissariats evacuated machinery and rolling stock eastward in July 1941. Where removal was impossible, demolition teams disabled equipment and bridges. Party and security structures left clandestine committees in major towns and rural districts to gather intelligence, distribute leaflets, and organize assistance for future operations. By late summer, central directives prioritized sabotage of rail and road traffic, supporting Army groups north and south. Instructions specified targets such as telegraph lines, culverts, and fuel dumps. In parallel, regular forces reformed behind the front, concentrating on rebuilding formations and training replacements while issuing guidance for underground cells to avoid premature engagements that would expose networks. Local political movements developed their own plans under the constraints of occupation policy. In Lithuania, the provisional government drafted ordinances to restore municipal courts, reorganize police, and reopen schools under supervision. Memoranda sought recognition of ministries with limited portfolios. In Latvia and Estonia, committees of former officials proposed standardized municipal law and requested authority to appoint mayors and judges subject to confirmation. In Western Ukraine, civic bodies associated with churches and professional associations outlined programs for welfare, schooling, and cultural societies. All such plans assumed space for autonomous decision-making in local matters while avoiding explicit claims of statehood. German civil administrations accepted measures that reduced administrative burdens, but rejected structures implying legislative competence or independent police power. Logistical doctrine shaped every plan. Army supply commands calculated daily requirements in tons per division for fuel, ammunition, and rations, and reserved a margin for unexpected operations. Civil administrations received residual capacity and were instructed to schedule cargo that could be held at depots without degrading combat readiness. This produced a sequencing in which city bakeries received flour when trains cleared frontline priorities, and municipal coal allocations varied with river levels, bridge repairs, and locomotive availability. Repair doctrine emphasized turnaround. Workshops triaged vehicles for quick fixes, cannibalized parts from captured types, and sent major overhauls back to better-equipped depots in the general government, or East Prussia. These measures aimed to flatten peaks in demand and keep both front and rear functioning, but they left little buffer for harvest surges or winter contingencies. Intelligence assessments informed expectations about resistance. Wehrmacht reports from July-September noted that population behavior varied by region, with rural compliance higher, near stable garrisons, and lower along contested corridors. Police summaries recorded theft from depots, black market activity, and isolated attacks on patrols. Civil administrations flagged forged travel permits and ration coupons as early fraud patterns. In response, planners introduced watermarking for documents, centralized printer control, and periodic exchange of identity cards. On the Soviet side, initial accounts from underground networks cited difficulties in communication and shortages of safe houses. Instructions stressed careful selection of targets and avoidance of actions that would trigger broad reprisals against communities providing support. By late autumn 1941, the planning picture for both civil jurisdictions showed a common structure, a centralized executive with local administrative branches, economic targets tied to harvest cycles and rail conversion milestones, security organized around corridors and nodes, and a communication strategy that projected order while minimizing political concessions. Assumptions about crop yields, transport reliability, labor availability, and the speed of restoring urban services would determine whether these plans could be executed in winter conditions and amid continued military operations to the north and south. The first months under civil rule coincided with continued military movement and produced immediate confrontations at junction towns, ports, and river crossings. In the Baltic area, German 18th Army secured Riga on July 1, 1941, and Tallinn by late August. Army Group North's Panzer Group 4 had passed eastward, leaving security to rear commands and police battalions stationed along the Riga-Daugavpils and Kaunas-Vilnius corridors. In Ukraine, Army Group South entered Kyiv on 19 September, after the encirclement west of the city, and Odessa fell on 16 October, following a siege conducted by the 11th Army and Romanian forces. These territorial changes moved the civil frontiers forward and handed large urban populations to administrations that had only partially formed. Civil officials arrived into towns where bridges were damaged, power plants operated on reduced capacity, and markets functioned irregularly under curfew. Early engagements reflected three kinds of clash: competition between German institutions, enforcement against designated groups, and local attempts to shape authority. Friction between civil commissioners and rear army commands surfaced over the allocation of buildings, telephones, and fuel. At Riga and Vilnius, civil offices requested priority wagons for flour and salt. Army transport officers assigned available capacity to front units and bridge repairs. Police and security staffs demanded detention space and ensured that identity card regimes and travel permits could be enforced with checkpoints on city approaches. These overlapping claims translated into daily orders that affected food distribution and movement, with civilians adjusting schedules to match inspection times and convoy windows. Security operations expanded from registration to arrests and shootings within weeks of occupation. Specialist detachments, police battalions, and local auxiliaries conducted actions against groups defined as enemies or suspects by central directives. In Kaunas, arrests and killings followed the anti-Soviet uprising of late June. A ghetto was ordered in July, with confinement completed in August. Vilnius received a ghetto order on September 6th, dividing residents between two sections. Ponary, a pre-war military site outside the city, became a location for mass shootings conducted through late summer and autumn. In Riga, a ghetto was established in October, after initial detentions in July-August. In Minsk, under Army Group Center's rear command but adjacent to Ostland, a ghetto was set up in July, with subsequent actions in the second half of 1941. These measures reshaped urban demography and labor availability as workshops and municipal services recorded losses of skilled workers and shopkeepers moved into restricted zones. In Ukraine, the capture of Kyiv generated a sequence of incidents that defined the opening phase of German rule in a major city. Between 24 and 28 September, explosions and fires destroyed parts of the central district around Kreshchatyk. German reports attributed the blasts to charges left by retreating Soviet units. Security authorities responded with arrests and cordons, while the Wehrmacht and municipal labor brigades cleared debris. On September 29th to 30th, security police and auxiliaries carried out mass shootings at Babi Yar, on the city's northwestern edge. German reports recorded 33,771 persons killed over 2 days. Subsequent actions in October and November extended arrests and shootings to other categories defined by police orders. These events occurred as the civil administration under the Reichskommissariat moved into Rivne and began appointing district staffs for Kyiv and Zhytomyr. Local offices had to manage water, bread, and housing for a city with damaged infrastructure and altered population structure. Coastal districts experienced a different pattern, shaped by port logistics. In Tallinn and Riga, port authorities and naval detachments prioritized clearing channels and repairing cranes to move timber, flax, and grain. Civil administrations reopened custom sheds and warehouse records to restart accounting for cargo. Security operations at docks and railheads concentrated on preventing theft and unauthorized movement, with patrols and passes required for workers. In Odessa, where Romanian forces held the city after mid-October, administrative arrangements mixed Romanian military police, German liaison staffs, and local municipal offices. Evacuation and fighting had reduced population numbers, and the reopening of bakeries and tram depots proceeded under limited coal allocations. Local initiatives tested administrative boundaries in the first months. In Lithuania, municipal committees petitioned to administer courts and schools. In July-August, these bodies cooperated with German district offices to reopen primary education, while submitting teacher lists for approval. In Latvia and Estonia, returning officials worked to standardize bylaws for municipal police and market regulation. In Western Ukraine, church hierarchies sought permits for seminaries and publications, while civic associations proposed welfare committees. Security authorities, applying central instructions, rejected any committees that implied legislative competence or independent policing, and detained activists whose programs suggested sovereign state claims. At the same time, civil offices relied on these networks to staff registries, ration boards, and sanitation services in towns where many experienced clerks had left. Rural areas saw early confrontations over grain deliveries and labor. Procurement boards posted quotas based on acreage and estimated yields. Village elders organized threshing, while gendarmerie patrols monitored movement of wagons to collection points. Shortfalls occurred where draft animals had been requisitioned during the Soviet retreat, or where bridges limited access to mills. In parts of Volhynia and Podylia, deliveries lagged behind plan because river crossings at smaller towns remained on ferries and winter roads had not yet formed. Civil administrations issued reminders that taxes in kind could be offset by labor on road and bridge repair. The Wehrmacht requested road crews for supply routes serving 6th and 17th Armies. These demands competed with harvesting and firewood collection, producing alternating peaks of labor at municipal depots and in fields. The first partisan incidents appeared along rail lines and in forests near river valleys. Reports in August-October noted cut telegraph lines, small charges on culverts, and ambushes of patrols in wooded zones of Belarus and northern Ukraine. In the Baltic interior, isolated shootings and arson against depots prompted rail guards to increase night patrols and to assign blockhouses at vulnerable points. Rear area commands requested additional police companies for the Vilnius-Lida and Daugavpils-Polotsk sectors. Civil administrations in adjacent counties introduced stricter travel permits and night curfews. Soviet instructions to underground cells emphasized reconnaissance and caution. Early actions tended to be small and aimed at disrupting rail schedules rather than holding ground. Urban economies restarted unevenly. Bakers in Riga and Kaunas reached near pre-war output by late September, using imported flour and local rye, while Kyiv's bakeries operated intermittently because of fuel shortages and allocation priority for front units. Tram lines in the Baltic capitals restored limited service once power plants secured coal or peat. In Kiev and Zhytomyr, transport relied on horse wagons and handcarts. Markets reopened with price controls set by municipal boards, but dual currency conditions and variable rations created arbitrage between garrison canteens, municipal shops, and private trade. Civil administrations sought to reduce uncertainty through fixed exchange rates and scheduled market days. Enforcement required police presence and resulted in detentions for violations such as trading outside, permitted hours, or transporting goods without papers. By the end of 1941, the opening clashes had established patterns that persisted. Civil, military, and police institutions competed for transport and office resources. Security operations set the framework for urban population management. Local committees operated within narrow administrative spaces, and rural deliveries and labor assignments linked village schedules to rail timetables. These early outcomes shaped morale and expectations. Some towns recorded restored services and regular bread distributions, while others experienced periodic shortages and stricter controls. The experience of occupation diverged by district depending on proximity to rail junctions, the presence of garrisons, and the intensity of security operations undertaken in response to sabotage or previous political activity. Escalation followed the first winter. Between December 1941 and March 1942, transport slowdowns, fuel shortages, and disease raised the administrative load, while the front consumed priority rail capacity. Civil offices in Riga, Kaunas, and Tallinn rationed coal to power plants, and shifted to peat where available. In Kyiv, Zhytomyr, and smaller towns west of the Dnipro, bakeries operated intermittently as flour deliveries followed irregular train schedules. Municipal health departments reopened hospitals using pre-war buildings and improvised wards. Typhus and dysentery cases rose in districts where water networks remained damaged and firewood collection lagged. Rear area commands assigned engineer companies to bridges and thaw-season road repair. Civil administrations reallocated labor brigades from sanitation to road gangs to keep supply routes open to depots at Minsk, Vilnius, and Fastiv. The winter crisis exposed the dependency of civilian provisioning on the same railheads and fuel depots that fed front units, reducing the margin for local improvisation. Political tension sharpened as institutions defined their roles for 1942. Alfred Rosenberg's ministry pushed for stable civil frameworks and expanded use of local administrators for routine tasks. In Ostland, Hinrich Lohse's staff drafted ordinances for courts and municipal finances and discussed limited advisory councils. In Ukraine, Erich Koch insisted on concentrated executive powers, limited municipal discretion, and strict control over appointments. Both jurisdictions issued school circulars for a phased reopening of primary classes and set language and textbook rules. Both retained the veto over curricula and teacher lists. Differences in tone appeared in correspondence on press policy, cultural associations, and church permits, but all proposals ran against the larger priorities of security and supply. Labor became the central field of escalation in spring 1942. On 21 March, Fritz Sauckel was appointed General Plenipotentiary for Labor Deployment, with authority to obtain workers for the Reich from occupied territories. Recruitment and conscription mechanisms expanded in April-May through registration drives, travel restrictions, and incentives linked to ration eligibility. District quotas were communicated to civil administrations and police. Municipal offices organized musters, medical checks, and transfers to railheads. By late 1942, large contingents from Ukrainian districts and smaller numbers from Baltic counties had been transported to industrial areas in the Reich. The movement of skilled and semi-skilled workers out of cities and towns affected municipal services, workshops, and agriculture. Civil offices petitioned for exemptions for tram crews, bakers, power plant attendants, and bridge maintenance teams. Rear commands balanced these requests against orders to keep frontline logistics and armament output supplied with labor. Security operations broadened as reports of sabotage and ambushes increased along key rail lines and in forested borderlands between Ostland and the Army Group Center rear area. Rear commands organized sector-wide sweeps with police regiments, security battalions, and locally recruited auxiliary units. Patrols targeted cut telegraph lines, culverts with small charges, and caches near villages. Railway protection included armored draisines and guard details on bridges and stations. Blockhouses and watch posts multiplied at junctions such as Daugavpils and Lyda. In northern Ukraine and adjacent Belarus, operations in March-April 1942 aimed to clear wooded zones near rail corridors feeding the Central Front. Civil administrations issued curfew extensions and travel pass restrictions in affected counties and coordinated with garrisons to keep markets and mills functioning during sweeps. After actions, reports recorded casualties, arrests, and relocations, along with notes on grain deliveries and livestock losses that influenced subsequent procurement tallies. Resource extraction accelerated with the 1942 harvest cycle. Procurement boards revised yield estimates downward to reflect seed shortages, draft animal losses, and abandoned acreage. Nonetheless, targets for grain, oil seeds, flax, and timber remained high. Port authorities in Riga and Ventspils prioritized timber and flax exports, while Ukrainian grain moved through railheads to the general government and into the Reich. Inland transport depended on gauge-converted lines and temporary bridge repairs. The Dnipro crossings at Kremenchuk and Dnipropetrovsk remained bottlenecks for any civil cargo scheduled after front requirements. Where rivercraft could supplement rail, district administrators organized barges for local flour movements, but winter damaged hulls and lack of fuel or grease limited throughput. Comparative reports from mid-1942 show Baltic timber movements approaching planned monthly tonnage on restored port cranes, while grain shipments from central Ukrainian districts often fell short of quota because of bridge priorities and locomotive shortages. Adjacent administrations added complexity. The Romanian-run zone of Transnistria, east of the Dniester between Odessa and the southern Bug, had its own command structures, police, and procurement plans. Although outside the Reichskommissariat, Ukraine, traffic through Odessa and road nets west of the southern Bug influenced flows of coal, salt, and manufactured goods into neighboring German districts. Coordination meetings among German, Romanian, and Army transport officers set customs procedures and wagon exchanges. Municipal managers in nearby German districts adjusted ration plans based on the capacity of shared corridors. This multi-authority environment required additional documentation for cargo and labor, and delays at boundary posts could stall bakery or hospital supplies scheduled for immediate use. International attention to occupation conditions increased in 1942. The Polish government in exile compiled reports from couriers and refugees on ration scales, labor drafts, and security operations. Soviet statements on rear area violence and resource requisitions were broadcast in Allied media and integrated into diplomatic exchanges. German broadcasts emphasized restoration of order, reopening of churches and schools, and the suppression of armed bands portrayed as criminal or partisan. Civil administrations contributed figures on market reopenings, school attendance, and agricultural deliveries to support press briefings. These information exchanges did not alter immediate priorities on the ground, but they shaped expectations among local populations and foreign observers regarding the trajectory of civil rule. Terrain and weather drove a second crisis during the Rasputitsa in March-April and again in October-November 1942. Thaw conditions turned unpaved roads into deep mud, raising fuel consumption for trucks and causing breakdowns among captured Soviet types with limited spare parts. Engineer units laid corduroy surfaces on critical stretches feeding depots. Civil offices redirected labor to road stabilization at the cost of reduced garbage collection and firewood distribution in towns. Rail remained the backbone, but locomotives required maintenance intervals that stretched when workshops lacked parts and workers. In some districts, administrators reduced bakery schedules to alternate days and consolidated hospitals to buildings with reliable boilers, then restored services as roads dried and coal deliveries resumed. The summer offensive of 1942 shifted the balance between front demands and civil provisioning. As Army Group South advanced toward the Don and the Volga, rail capacity and fuel from rear zones in Ukraine and the Baltics were reallocated to support Case Blue. Civil administrations received instructions to economize on coal and motor fuel and to increase deliveries of agricultural products to the Reich. Municipal authorities reduced tram services, shortened shop hours, and concentrated bread distribution in fewer outlets to save labor and fuel. Procurement boards expedited threshing and prioritized shipments scheduled to meet Reich import plans. In practice, the offensive increased transport pressure on the same junctions that sustained urban rationing and repair services, intensifying trade-offs between export quotas and local stability. By late 1942, escalation had produced a distinct operational pattern. Sauckel's labor program pulled workers from urban services and farms. Security sweeps expanded around rail corridors. Procurement targets strained transport and storage. And multi-layered command lines forced daily negotiation among civil offices, rear commands, and police. Casualty lists from security operations and disease statistics from municipal health departments rose and fell with the tempo of sweeps, ration adjustments, and seasonal constraints. Civil administrations documented gains in reopened schools, markets, and port tonnage where rail and sea links held, while recording shortfalls and emergency measures in counties further from junctions or closer to contested forests. The crisis was not a single event, but a cycle linked to weather, front movements, and administrative priorities, setting the conditions under which both resistance networks and occupation authorities would adapt in the following year. The period from mid-1942 to early 1943 marked the fullest extension of civil structures and the highest tempo of coordinated operations in both Ostland and Ukraine. By summer 1942, the administrative map was set. In Ostland, 4 Generalbezirke, Estland, Letland, Litauen, and Vice-Ruthenian, reported to Riga. In Ukraine, 6 Generalbezirke centered on Rivne coordinated districts for Volhynia, Podylia, Zhytomyr, Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and the southern littoral toward Crimea, while the Donbass and Crimea largely remained under military authority. Staff hierarchies were complete down to county offices, with registers of households, livestock, and acreage compiled for procurement and labor. Rail conversion on primary trunks linked Baltic ports and Belarusian junctions to East Prussia and, in Ukraine, fastened Kyiv, Shepetivka, and Fastiv to the general government network. With the gauge problem eased on main lines and temporary trusses in place on key bridges, civil administrations reached their maximum capacity to move food, timber, flax, and labor, while sustaining urban services at minimal levels. High command decisions clarified priorities. The Reich Ministry directed Reichskommissariat to push harvest collection and timber exports while expanding local administrative participation in schools, courts, and utilities under close supervision. The Army's rear commands retained first call on rail slots, fuel, and bridge maintenance. Civil cargo moved when front allocations allowed. Police and security chains of command enlarged their sphere through higher SS and police leaders in Riga and Rivne, linking order police regiments, security police field offices, and locally raised auxiliary battalions to sector plans keyed to rail corridors and forest belts. In practice, the peak consisted of synchronized calendars, harvest threshing and collection, rail dispatches timed to depot intake capacity, urban ration distributions, aligned with wagon arrivals, and periodic security operations to clear zones near vulnerable lines. The labor program reached its widest scale in this interval. Following the 21 March 1942 appointment of Fritz Sauckel, district quotas were increased quarter by quarter. Registration offices in Kyiv, Rivne, and Zhytomyr scheduled medical checks and departures. Baltic towns mustered smaller but steady contingents. By early 1943, cumulative transfers from Ukraine and the Baltics to the Reich had passed the 7-figure mark, with Ukraine providing the majority and the Baltics contributing thousands per month. Municipal managers sought exemptions for tram crews, power plant stokers, bakers, and bridge maintenance teams. Some were granted on condition of strict attendance, others were revoked when new quotas arrived. The removal of skilled workers created feedback loops in city services and workshops, requiring training of replacements drawn from rural districts or older age bands. Security and anti-partisan operations were mounted at their largest scale in 1942 to 1943 along the seams between Ostland, the Army Group Center rear area, and northern Ukraine. Sector commands conducted sweeps combining police regiments, security divisions, and auxiliary battalions raised locally. Operations targeted rail lines, culverts, depots, and villages identified in reconnaissance as waypoints or supply nodes. Reports listed cut telegraph lines repaired, explosives recovered, weapons seized, and arrests made. They also recorded burned buildings and relocations that followed cordon and search tactics. In Belarusian forest zones abutting Ostland, named operations ran through spring and summer 1942 and resumed after the autumn harvest. In northern Ukraine, sweeps concentrated along the Korostin-Kyiv and Shepetivka-Fastiv corridors. From the administrative perspective, these actions secured freight timetables for weeks at a time, but required curfews, pass regimes, and labor diversions that reduced municipal output and field work during the same periods. Population management reached a climax as urban ghettos established in 1941 were liquidated or transformed into labor camp networks between mid-1942 and the first months of 1943. In Riga, Vilnius, and Kaunas, large-scale actions in autumn 1942 reduced confined populations to selected labor groups attached to workshops and depots. in provincial towns across Ostland and in occupied Belarus, adjacent to it, ghettos were dissolved with survivors transferred to labor sites or executed in nearby forests. In Ukraine, ghettos created in larger towns after the 1941 advance were similarly dismantled through late 1942. Municipal ledgers reflected the administrative consequences. Housing inventories were reassigned, ration lists rewritten, and workshops either shuttered or repopulated with other labor categories. From the standpoint of civil offices tasked with utilities and markets, the immediate effect was a redistribution of urban space, while security authorities registered the outcome in event reports. Economically, the 1942 harvest represented the high watermark of organized procurement under civil rule. Procurement boards posted quotas for rye, wheat, barley, oats, potatoes, and oil seeds. Flax and timber targets were emphasized in the Baltics. Port authorities at Riga, Ventspils, and Tallinn reported monthly timber and flax loadings that approached or met planned figures once cranes and boilers were repaired. In Ukraine, grain assemblies at rural elevators fed rail shipments to junctions west of the Dnipro. Where traffic to the Reich tightened, consignments moved first to the general government and then onward. Comparative tables compiled in late 1942 showed Baltic timber exports stabilizing near planned tonnage, while Ukrainian grain deliveries fluctuated with the status of Dnipro bridge approaches and locomotive availability. City provisioning followed these rhythms. Bread rations were issued when consignments arrived and cut, when trains were diverted to front needs, or when thaw-season roads delayed local haulage. Coordination with the Romanian-administered Transnistria zone added a layer of peak-period complexity along the southern Bug, and at Odessa. Customs procedures, wagon exchanges, and shared road maintenance required standing conferences among German civil staffs, Romanian officials, and army transport officers. Coal, salt, and manufactured goods transited through corridors that served both civilian provisioning and front supply. Delays at boundary posts forced municipal ration boards in adjacent German districts to rework weekly plans. The administrative peak therefore involved not a surplus of resources, but the maximum synchronization of limited capacity among multiple authorities. Morale and discipline were managed through information and regulation rather than concessions of political authority. Newspapers and bulletins in Riga, Tallinn, Kaunas, Kiev, and Rivne published ordinances on rationing, labor registration, market hours, and school schedules, with occasional articles on reopened churches or cultural events. Civil courts resumed hearings for property disputes and minor offenses. Military courts retained jurisdiction over sabotage, weapons possession, and attacks on patrols. Travel permits, identity cards, and workbooks were standardized with new formats and watermarks to reduce forgery. Periodic exchanges of documents required citizens to re-register, giving administrations updated lists of addresses and occupations. For rural zones, procurement boards posted delivery calendars and used labor for tax offsets to keep bridges, roads, and mills working during peak traffic. The military situation framed the ceiling of what the civil peak could achieve. As the 1942 summer offensive extended lines toward the Don and the Volga, rail capacity, fuel, and rolling stock were pulled forward. Rear depots in the Baltics and Ukraine absorbed the shock by reducing tram timetables, consolidating hospital wards into buildings with reliable boilers, and concentrating bread distribution in fewer outlets. The administrative system continued to function, but only by shifting delays and shortages onto civilian schedules, and by tightening control measures during security sweeps. In aggregate statistics compiled for N1942 reviews, offices recorded thousands of kilometers of roads maintained, dozens of bridges kept passable through the thaw, schools reopened in many towns, and tonnages shipped by rail and sea. Parallel tables listed labor transfers to the Reich, curfew hours imposed, and sectors subjected to cordon operations. These paired ledgers captured the peak of the experiment: maximum institutional reach, maximum coordination across agencies, and maximum dependence on frontline priorities that left little margin for shock. Adaptation in 1942 to 1943 followed two tracks: organized resistance that learned to survive security sweeps, and occupation structures that adjusted procedures to keep rail, harvest, and labor programs running. In forest belts of northern Ukraine and adjacent Belarus, Soviet partisan staffs consolidated scattered detachments into brigades with defined zones and supply methods. After winter, 1942 to 1943, liaison officers coordinated airstrips on frozen lakes and clearings for night drops of weapons, explosives, and medical kits. Couriers linked villages, safe houses, and town informants. Targets shifted from small culverts to nodes, switch yards, fuel depots, and bridge approaches, timed to disrupt troop and grain trains before dispatch. Reports from rail districts recorded sequences of incidents on lines such as Korostin-Kiev and Lida-Vilnius. Cut telegraph lines followed by charges on rails, then fire at timber stacks near sidings. The pattern required longer repair teams, guard rotations, and night patrols, stretching the capacity of railway protection units and local auxiliaries. In the Baltics, resistance took a different path. Armed groups formed from men avoiding labor drafts, deserters, and remnants of earlier militias. Their numbers remained smaller than in the forests south and east, but grew as document exchanges and labor transports intensified. Networks concentrated on intelligence, evasion routes, and selective strikes against isolated posts rather than holding ground. In rural Estonia and Latvia, part-time bands assembled for brief actions and disbanded to resume farm work. Urban circles in Riga, Kaunas, and Tallinn produced forged papers, ration cards, and workbooks. Tailors and printers in small workshops became central to survival strategies for those facing registration or confinement. Church and charity structures organized food parcels and accommodation for families of detainees or for evacuees returning from destroyed districts. Ukrainian nationalist formations developed in parallel and in friction with both German authorities and Soviet undergrounds. By late 1942, armed detachments aligned with the organization of Ukrainian nationalists operated in Volhynia and Policia. In 1943, they consolidated under the name Ukrainian Insurgent Army, forming Sotny and Kureny with local support networks. These forces prioritized control of countryside zones, taxation in kind, and neutralization of rival structures, and they engaged German posts where this supported territorial control or procurement while avoiding fixed battles. Their presence altered village politics and labor availability. Elders negotiated between procurement boards, security patrols, and mobile insurgent units, deciding when to deliver quotas or hide grain and livestock. The multiplicity of armed actors increased risk on roads and at collection points, pushing administrators to concentrate depots near garrisons and to convoy grain wagons rather than rely on dispersed pickup. Occupation authorities adapted with layered security and administrative tools. Railway protection deployed armored trolleys and sentry towers at bridges and stations. Blockhouse spacing shortened on vulnerable stretches. Police regiments paired with locally recruited battalions to mount cordon and search operations, keyed to rail timetables. Rear commands introduced moving checkpoints on roads to interdict movement of explosives and to capture draft dodgers heading to forests. Document policy tightened. New identity cards were printed with watermarks. Periodic exchanges were ordered by street and village, and workbooks were stamped at plants and depots on fixed days to generate predictable flows through checkpoints. Municipal rationing linked higher rations to employment in utilities, bridge repair, and bakery shifts, incentivizing attendance and making absence a visible signal during patrol inspections. Partisan staffs adjusted by decentralizing sabotage cells and dispersing stocks. Small groups specialized in rail cutting with time charges, leaving larger units to screen withdrawal. Intelligence relied on station clerks, track workers, and depot laborers who reported train schedules, fuel deliveries, and guard patterns. In return, they received warnings of planned sweeps and assistance in evading labor drafts. Medical care moved to forest dugouts and village barns. Field surgeries were planned for nights after sweeps when patrol density ebbed. Command links to regular forces improved after winter 1942 to 1943. Radio sets allowed brigades to receive directives synchronized with front offensives, and sabotage intensified before and during operations on the central and southern fronts. Civil society adapted to shortages and controls with legal and illicit mechanisms. Household production expanded. Smokehouses, gardens, and shared woodlots reduced dependence on municipal allocations. Markets operated under price caps but developed side channels through barter and deliveries before posted hours. Gendarmerie patrols alternated enforcement with unofficial tolerance to keep food flowing. Workshops cannibalized parts from captured machinery and pre-war stockpiles. Tram depots in Reka and Kaunas kept limited lines running by pooling motors and removing cars from service to supply spares. In Kiev and Zhytomyr, where coal was intermittent, bakeries shifted to wood-fired ovens and adjusted schedules to match cargo arrivals. Schools reopened on shortened curricula. Teacher shortages were covered by older staff and by students promoted early to assistant roles. Security operations expanded in scale as occupation authorities sought to reclaim corridors. In spring-summer 1943, multi-county sweeps in Belarusian forests bordering Ostland combined police regiments, security battalions, and auxiliary units, with railroad engineer detachments following to repair lines and bridges. In northern Ukraine, operations along the Shepetivka-Fastiv sector aimed to push partisan groups beyond artillery range of key junctions before harvest. Civil administrations prepared contingency plans for these periods. Ration distributions were advanced by several days. Hospitals consolidated wards to safer buildings. Village elders received passes for mill and bridge workers to prevent blanket detentions that would halt flour production. After operations, reports often noted temporary stabilization of rail schedules for 2 to 6 weeks, followed by renewed incidents as dispersed groups reassembled. The labor question remained central to adaptation. Quotas for transfers to the Reich continued through 1943. Families devised avoidance strategies through forged documents, medical certificates, and temporary relocations to relatives in districts with slower registration. Civil offices negotiated exemptions for utility crews and bridge teams, arguing that breakdowns would jeopardize army supply. Some exemptions were granted, others rescinded after periodic reviews. For agricultural peaks, administrators exchanged labor for tax formulas, allowing households to meet grain deliveries by sending members to road gangs or mill shifts. These adjustments preserved minimum services but reduced reserves for shocks, making towns vulnerable to disruptions when a single rail delay or sweep coincided with illness among scarce skilled workers. Foreign and frontier factors shaped adaptation at the southern edge. Coordination with Romanian authorities along the Dnipro and in traffic through Odessa required standardized passes and wagon seals. Disputes over priority cargoes, coal, salt, hospital supplies, were settled in joint conferences. Delays at boundary posts forced municipal managers in adjacent German districts to compress bread schedules and ration distributions. To mitigate volatility, administrations built small buffer stocks near junctions and ports, guarded by mixed police and auxiliary details. By early autumn 1943, both sides had institutionalized their methods. Resistance networks in forests and countryside linked sabotage cells, supply caches, and village supporters to radio-guided schedules tied to front operations. Nationalist formations in western Ukraine maintained rural control systems that taxed, recruited, and negotiated with or fought occupation units depending on local balance. Occupation authorities integrated security, transport, and provisioning calendars into cycles that combined sweeps, repairs, and ration distributions, accepting reduced services in order to protect rail movement. Civilians navigated these systems with layered strategies: legal employment in protected utilities, clandestine assistance to armed groups, compliance with procurement where unavoidable, and evasion where possible. Adaptation did not eliminate conflict. It created a moving equilibrium in which rail traffic could be stabilized for periods, markets could reopen under supervision, and resistance could reform after each sweep, setting the conditions for the larger shift that followed as front lines moved west. The turning point for civil rule in Ostland and Ukraine came as front operations reversed the direction of movement in 1943 to 1944. After the failure of the German offensive at Kursk in July 1943, where Soviet forces concentrated roughly 1.3 million personnel in Central and Voronezh fronts against approximately 780,000 in Army Group Center and South. Along the salient, the Red Army initiated a sequence of counteroffensives that pushed the front back onto the administrative heart of both jurisdictions. The lower Dnipro operations from August to December 1943 forced crossings at multiple sectors, culminating in the recapture of Kyiv on the 6th of November. In early 1944, the Dnipro-Carpathian campaign deployed several Soviet fronts totaling over 2 million personnel against German and Allied formations in right bank Ukraine, numbering on the order of 1 million, with the result that most districts west of the river shifted from civil to military emergency regimes or fell out of German control entirely. Administratively, this was the inflection where procurement schedules and labor transfers ceased to be the calendar and were replaced by evacuation orders, bridge demolitions, and rearward compressions of civil staffs. Partisan action magnified the shift by contesting rail corridors that civil administrations depended on for food and labor movements. In summer-autumn 1943, coordinated sabotage campaigns against rails, bridges, and depots increased the frequency of line closures on corridors such as Shepetivka-Fastiv, Korostin-Kyiv, and Lida-Vilnius. Railway protection and repair units could still restore traffic, but the time between successive cuts narrowed. As a result, civil trains carrying grain or evacuees queued behind military transports or were rerouted onto longer paths. Market calendars and ration distributions in district towns were rewritten week by week to match unpredictable arrivals. Labor offices faced declining compliance as families dispersed. Workbooks were no longer stamped on schedule, and exemptions for utility crews and bridge teams became moot in districts where plants shut down or where power stations lacked fuel. The erosion of civil capacity was most visible in Ukraine during the 1943 to 1944 winter. District offices west of Kyiv attempted to maintain bread and hospital schedules as long as railheads at Fastiv, Berdychaev, and Zhytomyr remained open. Once these junctions came under threat, administrations moved archives and staffs to Rivne and then further west. Orders prioritized the removal of specialist workers, municipal cash boxes, and typewriters. In practice, departures were constrained by locomotive availability and road conditions. Security forces increased checkpoints and curfews to control movement and to collect transport for demolitions and convoy guards. Procurement boards stopped setting monthly grain quotas and shifted to emergency levies to feed garrisons during withdrawals. Where bridges were judged untenable, engineer units prepared demolitions that would also erase the transport basis for any continuing civil provisioning. In Ostland, the turning point followed several months later. 1944, Soviet offensives in the northern sector built pressure on as well. During Operation Bagration in June and August 1944, approximately 2.3 million Soviet personnel in 4 fronts struck Army Group Center, which counted roughly 800,000 troops. The result was the collapse of the central German position and exposure of the southern and eastern approaches to the Baltic. Subsequent operations by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts crossed into the administrative map of Ostland, cutting the Daugavpils-Vilnius and Polotsk-Riga lines and forcing withdrawals from General Bezirk vice Ruthenian. Civil staffs in Riga ordered the evacuation of offices from inland counties. Coastal ports concentrated on moving timber and flax stockpiles out while preparing for their own closure. Estonia saw a planned withdrawal in September 1944, coordinated with naval lift. After Soviet forces broke through the Tartu front, Tallinn changed hands on 22 September and Riga on 13 October, compressing German control into Courland, where Army Group Kurland held a pocket supplied by sea. Collaborationist and auxiliary formations altered the balance at the turning point by shifting roles and locations. In the Baltics, Latvian and Estonian units formed in 1943 as divisions within Waffen-SS structures, while police and auxiliary battalions with local recruits were reassigned from rail security to front-adjacent tasks. In western Ukraine, nationalist formations expanded their rural presence in 1943 and into 1944, focusing on countryside control and avoidance of set-piece engagements with large formations. Their activity influenced village decisions about grain delivery, evacuation, and cooperation with German or Soviet authorities as fronts moved. From the administrative perspective, these forces changed the risk calculus on roads and at depots. Grain and evacuee convoys required escorts. Isolated county offices closed rather than operate inside zones where multiple armed actors set incompatible rules. Evacuation policy produced a second-order turning effect. As German units withdrew, directives ordered the removal or destruction of assets vital to transport and supply. Rails lifted on sidings, bridges blown, telephone lines cut, grain stocks burned if they could not be moved. Civil administrations were instructed to clear prisons, transfer detainees, and remove or destroy documents. In practice, execution varied. Some towns organized trains that carried mixed loads of officials, families, and archives. Others dispersed offices by road or left registers behind in locked rooms. Port cities in the Baltics embarked cargo and personnel onto ships as long as naval control of approaches held. When corridors closed, remaining stocks were abandoned or destroyed. These measures stabilized retreating military formations by denying resources to the pursuers, but also eliminated the infrastructure necessary for ongoing civil provisioning. For civilians, the turning point meant rapid changes in jurisdiction and regulations. In Ukraine, cities like Kiev, Zhytomyr, and Vinnytsia switched from German civil ordinances to Soviet military administration within days or weeks. Registries reopened under new authorities, ration books were issued, and screenings for collaboration or forced labor participation began. In the Baltics, 1944 transfers occurred later, but with similar administrative sequences. Re-establishment of Soviet municipal offices, reopening of rail under 1,520 mm gauge as conversion reversed, and legal reviews of property transfers and appointments made during 1941 to 1944. Populations that had adapted to German rationing and labor rules now faced Soviet mobilization and security screening. Individuals associated with German administrations or local auxiliary forces attempted to evacuate with withdrawing units or to hide their roles. Information warfare accompanied the military and administrative turning. German broadcasts in 1944 emphasized evacuation discipline and the promise of holding coastal pockets. Municipal bulletins in remaining towns announced shortened rations and curfews tied to demolition schedules. Soviet statements publicized the recapture of oblast centers and ports, along with figures on reopened schools and factories. International reporting drew on these claims as well as on accounts from refugees moving west and east. For civil administrators who remained at desks until the last trains departed, the information battle was subsumed by transport graphs and lists of keys handed over to engineer detachments preparing demolitions. By late 1944, the experiment in civil rule had been reduced to enclaves. In Ukraine, administrative functions under German control ceased as front lines passed the 1939 border into Galicia and then into Poland. In Ostland, activities contracted to Riga prior to its loss, then to ports feeding the Courland pocket. Civil staffs that remained focused on welfare for evacuees, ration distributions from diminishing stocks, and liaison with military and naval commands. The turning point, therefore, did not produce a negotiated redesign of civil rule. It imposed a military timetable that subordinated or erased civil structures. What had been the peak of synchronized procurement, labor, and security cycles became an exercise in controlled withdrawal, asset denial, and transfer of authority to successor regimes advancing behind the front. By late 1944, the civil administrations created in 1941 existed only in fragments. In Ukraine, German offices ended as front lines moved through Volhynia, Podylia, and Galicia into occupied Poland. In the Baltics, authority contracted to Riga and ports supplying the Courland pocket. The German withdrawal converted administrative ledgers into lists of evacuations, demolitions, and asset transfers. Railway commands lifted sidings and prepared bridge charges. Telephone lines were cut. Stocks that could not be moved were destroyed on engineer schedules. In cities taken by the Red Army, emergency municipal committees reopened under Soviet military officials. Gauge reconversion to 1,520 millimeters began at once. Workshops assembled small locomotives and rail cars from stored parts, and traffic resumed in stages toward Minsk, Vilnius, Riga, Kyiv, and Odessa. Combat operations ended in each sector with distinct sequences. Kyiv had changed hands on the 6th of November, 1943. Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia followed in January. March 1944. Odessa was taken on the 10th of April. In the north, Vilnius fell on 13th July, 1944. Kaunas in early August, Tallinn on 22nd September, Riga on 13th October. Army Group Courland, isolated after October, held sectors around Liepaja, Ventspils, and Tukums, with approximately 200,000 to 230,000 troops supplied by sea, until capitulation on 8th to 9th May 1945. Evacuation lift moved civilians and officials from Baltic ports, while naval traffic allowed continued export of small timber consignments and intake of coal until routes closed. After surrender, organized German civil structures disappeared. Remaining personnel entered prisoner columns or sought passage west. Immediate administrative consequences followed Soviet return. Military commandantures re-established municipal departments for water, power, housing, and transport. City Soviets updated registries, issued ration cards, and reopened schools under wartime curricula. Conscription offices called up men in recovered territories. In 1944 to 1945, new contingents reinforced fronts moving into East Prussia and Silesia. Screening and legal procedures began for residents who had worked in German offices, auxiliary police, or labor programs. NKVD and SME-RSH filtration points processed returning prisoners of war and civilian laborers. By 1946, over 4 million repatriated Soviet citizens had passed through screening, with outcomes ranging from release to reassignment to labor units or prosecution. Local courts reviewed property transfers and employment under occupation. Sentences varied by role and locality. Humanitarian conditions reflected 4 years of destruction. Urban housing stock in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk showed whole blocks burned or mined. In Riga and Tallinn, dock areas and power plants required months of repair. Coal shortages forced continued use of wood and peat. Bakery output rose and fell with rail deliveries and weather. Hospitals consolidated into buildings with intact boilers and roofs. Typhus and dysentery rates declined, where water networks were repaired and vaccination campaigns reached target numbers. Food supply depended on harvests from districts not stripped during withdrawals and on rail reopening. Ration scales improved as through traffic stabilized to Minsk and Kyiv in late 1944, and to the Baltic capitals in winter, 1944 to 1945, but remained below pre-war norms. Population movements introduced additional complexity. Evacuees who had moved east in 1941 to 1942 returned in waves that did not match housing availability or job slots. Municipal offices prioritized skilled workers for power, rail, and hospital assignments. From the west, refugees and demobilized personnel arrived with diverse papers and claims. Families separated by evacuations, labor transfers, or retreats sought records across jurisdictions. In the Baltics, groups associated with German administrations attempted sea evacuation in September-October 1944. Those who remained faced screening and, in some cases, arrest for collaboration charges. Early deportations in 1944 to 1945 targeted selected categories, while larger actions came later. In the immediate aftermath, arrests focused on individuals linked to occupation structures or on armed nationalists. Armed conflict did not end everywhere when city centers changed hands. In western Ukraine, formations of the Ukrainian insurgent army maintained control in parts of Volhynia and Galicia through 1944 to 1945, engaging NKVD troops, military units, and local recruits. Operations range from ambushes to attacks on posts. In the Baltics, armed groups operated in forest zones after 1944. Their numbers were lower than in western Ukraine, but sufficient to require large internal security deployments and successive sweeps. These campaigns influenced rural administration, grain collection, tax in kind, and road maintenance proceeded under convoy, or were delayed until security operations passed. Legal and diplomatic processes formalized the end of the occupation framework. After Germany's capitulation on May 8, 1945, Allied agreements recognized Soviet control over the annexed Baltic republics and the western Ukrainian territories incorporated in 1939 to 1940. War crimes investigations and trials proceeded in multiple jurisdictions. German officials, police, and local auxiliaries captured in 1944 to 1945 faced charges in Soviet courts. Additional trials occurred in Poland and the Baltic republics. Documentation from German civil offices, preserved or recovered in county buildings, became evidence in proceedings concerning deportations, ghettos, and executions carried out in 1941 to 1943. Municipal records were used to reconstruct rationing histories and employment patterns for legal review and for entitlement to post-war benefits. Economically, the immediate aftermath replaced extraction with reconstruction. In Ukraine, 1945 plans prioritized coal from Donbass, steel from newly repaired mills, and grain from right bank districts to support industrial restart. Rail repair brigades converted remaining 1,435 mm segments back to 1,520 mm and restored signaling. The Baltic ports returned to their pre-war roles within the Soviet system, handling timber and mixed cargoes under state plans. Shipyards repaired coastal craft and barges. Labor was mobilized through demobilization assignments and urban workbooks. Shortages of skilled personnel were acute, where evacuation or screening removed key specialists. International relief did not operate in Soviet-held zones. Reconstruction depended on domestic allocations and reparations sourced from occupied Germany. Civilians marked the end of German rule with overlapping experiences. Some households saw stabilization of bread, fuel, and school schedules within months. Others contended with continued shortages, screenings, and security operations. Families of those taken to the Reich as laborers or drafted into German service negotiated repatriation and legal status. Records from German labor offices and municipal registries were cross-checked with Soviet documents to resolve claims. In the Baltics, property disputes arose where wartime appointments and transfers conflicted with pre-1940 titles. Courts applied Soviet law to adjudicate cases. The human toll remained visible in cemeteries taken over by new authorities and in vacant plots where districts depopulated by deportations and shootings did not immediately repopulate. By mid-1945, the withdrawal had ended and successor administrations were embedded. The infrastructure of civil rule established by Germany, commissioners, county offices, ration boards, was replaced by Soviet municipal and regional structures. The rail gauge and legal codes reverted to the pre-1941 standard of the USSR. The humanitarian crisis eased unevenly as repairs progressed and rail capacity returned, but screenings, prosecutions, and armed resistance sustained a security presence in many rural districts. The immediate aftermath thus combined the end of one administrative system with the imposition of another, the reopening of utilities with the continuation of internal security campaigns, and the legal unwinding of occupation actions with new legal frameworks that governed recovery and control. The legacy of the civil administrations established in 1941 is measured along institutional, demographic, economic, and legal lines, with interpretations shaped by subsequent political frameworks. Institutionally, the experiment demonstrated the limits of proxy governance without sovereignty concessions. Administrative chains designed in Berlin, Reichskommissariat, Generalkommissare, Gebietskommissare, functioned when military conditions and transport capacity were favorable and failed when front demands or sabotage reduced rail throughput below planned levels. Comparative records show that Baltic port districts sustained timber and flax exports near planned figures in late 1942, whereas Ukrainian grain movements fluctuated with Dnipro crossing status and locomotive availability. The contrast reflected geography and the degree of military overlap, not a stable policy difference. In both jurisdictions, attempts to use local personnel in municipal offices, schools, and police were bounded by vetoes over appointments and by security measures that subordinated civilian planning to police and army priorities. Demographically, the occupation coincided with large population losses from multiple causes: front combat, evacuation, deportation, forced labor transfers, ghettoization, and executions in 1941 to 1943, disease, and shortages linked to transport disruption. City registries and post-war investigations documented declines in urban populations between 1941 and 1944, and partial recoveries after rail reopening. In the Baltics, pre-war Jewish communities in Riga, Kaunas, Vilnius, and provincial towns were largely destroyed during 1941 to 1943. In Ukraine, major centers such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa lost large proportions of pre-war Jewish populations in 1941 to 1942, and additional residents through labor drafts and evacuations. Post-war repatriation screened millions of returning civilians and prisoners of war, producing further movements as individuals were released assigned to labor units or prosecuted under Soviet law. The demographic structure in 1945 differed markedly from 1940 in age distribution, skill availability, and community composition. Economically, the 4-year cycle left transport networks altered and then reversed. Gauge conversion to 1,435 millimeters on main trunks allowed movement of German rolling stock in 1941 to 1943. Reconversion to 1,520 millimeters in 1944 to 1945 restored integration into the Soviet rail system. Bridges erected as temporary trusses in 1941 to 1942 were replaced or rebuilt post-war, ports repaired for timber export. In 1942, return to mixed cargo under Soviet planning. Procurement tables from 1942 recorded peak timber exports from Baltic ports and variable grain deliveries from Ukraine. Post-war plans reoriented these flows towards Soviet industrial centers and reconstruction targets. Municipal finance and rationing systems introduced under German rule ended in 1944 to 1945 and were replaced by Soviet workbooks, ration cards, and tax, in-kind or monetary taxes consistent with wartime and immediate post-war regulations. Legally, the occupation generated documentation used in multiple proceedings: German decrees, county ledgers, police reports, and transport manifests were examined in Soviet trials from 1943 onward and later in Allied venues. Local auxiliary personnel and German officials faced charges related to actions in 1941 to 1943. Verdicts varied by role, location, and evidence. Property transfers, police appointments, and labor office records were reviewed by restored municipal courts and security agencies to determine rehabilitation, penal assignments, or reinstatement. The legal dimension also included international recognition of territorial outcomes. The incorporation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the USSR was affirmed in Allied diplomacy by 1945, and the Western Ukrainian territories annexed in 1939 to 1940 remained within the Ukrainian SSR. These decisions framed subsequent debates over collaboration, resistance, and jurisdiction. Politically, the promise and withdrawal pattern defined the memory of the experiment. In June or July 1941, local groups in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Western Ukraine attempted to restore or proclaim national institutions. By August-September 1941, these efforts had been curtailed by the refusal of recognition and by arrests. District-level cooperation persisted in technical fields, utilities, schools, sanitation, but without legislative authority. The contrast between early expectations of autonomy and the subsequent emphasis on extraction, labor mobilization, and security operations became a key point of post-war analysis. Scholars and commissions have compared policy tone and implementation between Riga and Rivne, noting differences in personnel and rhetoric. For example, Hinrich Lohse's administrative circulars versus Erich Koch's instructions, but also the convergence produced by shared constraints, rail slot scarcity, front priorities, and police jurisdiction. For armed actors outside state structures, the legacy diverged by region. Soviet partisan networks merged into post-war narratives of rear support for regular forces, with emphasis on rail sabotage prior to major offensives. In western Ukraine, nationalist formations that had expanded in 1943 continued armed activity against Soviet authorities into the late 1940s, and in the Baltics, smaller forest-based groups operated after 1944. These conflicts influenced amnesties, deportations, and internal security budgets for years. The administrative decisions of 1941 to 1943, especially labor registration, document controls, and procurement, formed part of the evidence used by all sides to define supporters and opponents in the immediate post-war period. Commemoration and historiography evolved in stages. In the late Soviet period, memorials and publications emphasized military liberation and civilian suffering within frameworks set by state policy. After 1991, the Baltic states and independent Ukraine developed additional research programs, museum exhibitions, and memorial sites that distinguish between occupation regimes, documented local administrative participation, and integrated deportation, ghetto, and mass shooting sites into national narratives. Locations such as Babi Yar near Kyiv, Ponary near Vilnius, and Rumbula near Riga became focal points for research and remembrance. Archival releases and forensic studies refine casualty estimates and event chronologies. Parallel work examined municipal functioning, transport management, and procurement to reconstruct daily governance beyond headline events. Strategically, the experiment's significance lies in demonstrating how civil governance without sovereignty can sustain extraction for limited periods but cannot stabilize large occupied regions when military priorities dominate transport and security. The Reichskommissariat framework created ordered ledgers, household registers, freight graphs, labor rosters, but these depended on rail capacity controlled by the army and on police enforcement that generated resistance and administrative overhead. When front requirements expanded in 1942 and reversed in 1943 to 1944, civil structures compressed and then dissolved. For successor administrations in 1944 to 1945, the immediate utility of occupation-era records was practical: addresses, skills, infrastructure maps, even as legal reviews assessed the roles of those who staffed the offices. The long-term consequence for the region was a post-war state landscape shaped by wartime administrative boundaries and transport repairs. Rail junctions prioritized in 1941 to 1943 remained nodes in 1945 planning. Ports restored for timber exports in the Baltic resumed key positions under Soviet trade. Urban spaces altered by 1941 to 1943 demolitions. Ghetto liquidations and reallocations were rebuilt with new housing plans and industrial assignments. The historical debate continues to compare declared aims in mid-1941 with institutional behavior by late 1942, contrasting promises to local populations with the documented outcomes in procurement, labor, and security. The record shows a sequence: initial administrative opportunity conditioned by recent Soviet annexations, rapid establishment of civil hierarchies, peak extraction synchronized with rail conversion, and contraction under military reverses. As a result, the experiment remains a case study in occupation governance where intentions, administrative design, and operational limits can be compared across two adjacent jurisdictions operating under similar strategic pressures but different local conditions.